Good evening, my dear friends. Tonight's lecture on the books of Ezra and Nehemia is in memory of Professor Earl Yitzchok Shindel, who passed away on the 12th of October in 2002. May his memory be a blessing to his family and to all of Israel. The books of Ezra and Nehemia in the Talmud are counted as one book. There's the book of Ezra, and but they're really two books. They describe two different personalities, and they describe different times of the beginning of the Second Commonwealth. Now, if we go back in history a little, the Jews are taken into Babylonian captivity by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonia. Nebuchadnezzar is succeeded by Belshazzar, whom I discussed in last week's lecture about Daniel. Belshazzar is overthrown by the Persians, and the Persians come to rule Bavel, and they come to rule Eretz Yisrael. They come to rule practically the entire Middle East, the great Persian Empire. Their leader is a man called Koresh, Cyrus, and like all modest leaders, he calls himself Cyrus the Great. We will find the great occurs many times in history. Very few of them are worthy of the title. Cyrus, about 42 years after the destruction of the temple, is motivated to send the Jews back to the land of Israel, to allow them to return, and also to allow them to rebuild the temple. However, all of this has to be done under Persian rule. And he gives a proclamation in which he says, and we'll discuss each of the proclamations at greater length later in the lecture, in which he says, anyone who wants to worship the God of the heavens and the earth, meaning the Almighty God, because the Persians were pagans, they were Zoroastrians, they believed in gods of light and of darkness, but they also had the concept that there's like a chief god. And they never quite understood the Jewish faith, didn't understand the Jewish concept of monotheism, so they always said that the Jews worship the chief god, the god in charge of all the other gods. So he said anybody that wants to worship the God of gods, the great God, can go back to the land of Israel and there begin a life again as a Jewish commonwealth. Now, he had not only a holy motive in mind, he had an ulterior motive in mind as well, because the country lay waste. The country was under the control of the Samaritans, the Shomronim, various foreign tribes, non-Jewish tribes, Arabs, others that were in the country, and the country was going nowhere. It was not producing taxes because it had practically no economy, and he thought that if he sent the Jews back, then somehow the situation would improve. So he takes Sheshbatzar is the head of the Jewish community, who he's either the son or the grandson of Yehoiachin, one of the last kings of Judah. So he's a direct descendant of the king of Judah, and he is from the house of David, and he's really a legitimate pretender to the throne. Most of the commentators feel that he is a son of Yehoiachin, and therefore he is a nephew of Tzidkiyahu, the last king of Israel. Tzidkiyahu's sons were executed by Nebuchadnezzar, but he's a nephew, and he comes to reign over Judah, but he's not going to be the king. he's going to be a Persian puppet to a great extent. He has to do what the Persians want, and he has many problems. One problem, he has no army. He's not allowed to have an army. The second problem is that after all of this big fuss, only 12,000 Jews go back to Israel with him. He's unable to take more than 12,000 Jews with him. 12,000 Jews are not going to populate Jerusalem, let alone the entire country of Judah, and they're not going to be strong enough to rebuild the temple, and they're not going to be strong enough or numerous enough to rebuild the country. But the Jews always felt that Koresh was a hero. He's reflected as a hero in the Tanakh. He's reflected as a hero in the book of Ezra because, after all, he took the first steps to allow the Jews to come back. In modern times, at the time of the Balfour Declaration, for instance, the Zionist movement proclaimed Balfour as being the successor to Cyrus the Great, to Koresh. But the English were the new Persian Empire that was taking over the country, had a mandate, and they were going to allow the Jews to build a national homeland in the land of Israel. And Balfour and Lloyd George and the others that promulgated this, they were Koresh. And Sir Herbert Samuel, the Jew that was appointed as the Lord High Commissioner, the first High Commissioner for Palestine, the Jews saw originally in him Nehemiah. It turned out that the British were not Koresh and that Samuel was not Nehemiah. But that comes later. That's only after you have the experience of the matter. But initially, they saw it in comparable terms. After, this is a quick review of the book. After Koresh dies, so then he is succeeded by Darius, by Daryovesh, Darius the First. Now the name Cyrus and the name Xerxes, the name Darius repeats itself over and over again in the Persian monarchy. So this is Darius the First, who's approximately comes to power 10, 12 years after, so it's just before the story of Purim. Just before the story of Purim. And the Jews run into a lot of trouble. They don't have enough people to populate the country. They don't have the resources to rebuild the temple. And they have plenty of enemies in the country. The non-Jewish population in the country is very inimical to the Jews coming and to the Jews doing anything. And there are open acts of violence and terrorism against the Jews. And the Persians do little, if nothing, to prevent it. So the entire thing falls apart. The whole venture falls apart. And under Darius, an order, an edict is given that says that the Jews have to stop all work on the temple, and that the Jews have to stop all work on rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. Now, rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem was a main idea, because if Jerusalem could be fortified, and in the ancient world, walls were the fortification. I'm sure that there was an international court that said that the wall in Jerusalem was illegal, but nevertheless the Jews tried to build the walls, and if they would have been successful in building the walls, so then even with a small population they would be defended, or they would have a foothold in the country, and therefore every effort was made by the non-Jewish population to prevent them from somehow rebuilding the walls. Darius rescinds Cyrus's edict. He says that the situation has changed. It's dangerous for the Jews to build a temple. It's dangerous for the Persian Empire that the Jews should fortify the walls of Jerusalem. Everything has to stop. So that's bad news. The good news is Darius dies. and he's succeeded by Achashverosh, our Achashverosh. Now, there are all sorts of midrashim regarding Achashverosh, but the historians, and especially the Persian historians, tell us that Achashverosh was either the son or the nephew of Darius. The Medrash is that he was a complete outsider to the royal family, and that therefore he was interested in marrying Queen Esther because of the fact that she would grant legitimacy. But if Queen Esther didn't tell her who she was, so then how did he know that she was from the royal house? The Medrash has lots of problems, but the Midrashim are not here to tell us history or even to tell us facts. The Midrashim are here to give us a sense of values, a sense of ideas, a sense of what Judaism stands for. So in any event, Achashverosh becomes the king. When Achashverosh becomes the king, the story of Purim occurs. There is a threat of complete genocide against the Jewish people. The destruction not just of the Jews in Jerusalem, but the destruction of the Jews throughout the Persian Empire, throughout the known civilized world. And the Jews are miraculously delivered from that by Mordechai and Esther. And because of that, we have the holiday of Purim. Achashverosh does not grant the Jews the right to go back, and he does not grant the Jews the right to rebuild the temple. After Achashverosh comes another emperor. According to most of the historians, this emperor, Artaxerxes, who is Xerxes, is the son of Achashverosh. Now, the son of Achashverosh does not mean that he is the son of Esther. Achashverosh spread the wealth around, and he had many wives and many concubines, and an oriental potentate with a harem, and therefore his mother, it's unlikely that his mother was Queen Esther. It's unlikely that he was halachically Jewish. But in any event, Artaxerxes is the one that renews the right of the Jews, and now a new aliyah occurs with Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is a nephew of Sheshbatzar, and he is also a direct descendant of the king Yehoiachin. He's a grandson, the next generation, and he is again the pretender to the throne. And Zerubbabel is mentioned in the Novi Zechariah and in Novi Chagai, and all the Nevi'im of the time mention him, and he comes and he has greater success because he is able to bring more Jews, but again, not a substantial amount of Jews. Now, Zerubbabel is a wonderful person, but he is not the figure that can rally the Jewish people. And what happens in this story is that the Jews who came originally, and the Jews who came with Zerubbabel, because there was really no strong Torah leadership, and there was no strong political leadership either, a strange thing happened to them. They assimilated into their enemies, and many of them intermarried. You had a large wave of intermarriage, of marrying non-Jewish women, which made for non-Jewish children, which made for the demographic end of the Jewish society. And this wave of intermarriage was not limited to a lower class or to people who didn't care. The priestly families, the Kohanim, the leaders of the people all had intermarried and intermarried children. We read in the Novi Zechariah that the Kohen Gadol Yoshua, who was supposed to be the Kohen Gadol from the family of Tzadok, so he's chosen to be the Kohen Gadol, and he appears before the Novi. The Tanakh describes it, b'bgodim tzoim, in dirty clothes. So the Gemara says, what does it mean, dirty clothes? His sons were intermarried, and therefore he feels ambivalent at best is serving as the Kohen Gadol when he has non-Jewish grandchildren. When he's in his own family, they are intermarried. And this intermarriage was a widespread thing. Those that try to minimize it, I've seen Svarim that say that it's only a few, but it seems both from the simple rendition of what the Tanakh says in the book of Ezra and from the historical notes of the times, it seems that it was quite widespread, and that there were with a high percentage of Jews that intermarried into the non-Jewish population. You also had an abandonment of Torah observance. The stores, all the Jewish stores in Jerusalem were open on the Sabbath. The laws of kashrus were ignored. The whole thing fell apart. And there was no one who could stop it. So now there arises one of the great figures in all of Jewish history. Chazal say, "Ilmole lo nitna Torah al yedei Moshe, nitna al yedei Ezra." If the Torah would not have been given to us by Moshe, it could have been given to us by Ezra. Ezra is on the same plane as Moshe. No one is Moshe's equal, but he's in that category in terms of leadership, in terms of personality, in terms of who he is. And Ezra goes to the king, and he receives permission. He's a Kohen, Ezra's a Kohen, and he's a Sofer. He's a scribe. And the king, Artaxerxes, grants him an official position, that he is the king's representative to the Jewish community that is living in Jerusalem and Judah. And because of the fact that he was the king's representative, so therefore he had official status, much more official status than if he would have come just as plain Rabbi Ezra. Because there's always no shortage of rabbis, so what's the difference? But here, since he had the paper in his hand that he's backed by the king, by the emperor, so he has greater political and moral power. He still has no army. And without an army, it's useless. You cannot build a country without having the ability to defend yourself militarily. So Ezra arrives now, and Ezra attempts to bring a greater immigration. And he brings with him 42,000 Jews, which is also small change. But that was the greatest number that came at one time. They came with Ezra, and Ezra did the following. Ezra left in Bovel all, they used to say in Yiddish that there's Feine Eden and Proste Eden. Like the upper class, the fine, the intelligentsia, and then the masses, the common people. Ezra took the common people. And the Gemara teaches us, Asara Yuchsin Olam Bovel. Ezra brought with him 10 different categories of yichus. He brought the mamzerim, he brought the gerim, the sinim. He brought everybody that nobody wanted. They're the ones that came. In Bovel, Lo'olo Ezra me Bovel ad she'oso Bovel kesoletz nekiya. Ezra did not come from Bovel. He left Bovel like the best refined flour, to the extent that the rabbi said that if you could prove your pedigree that you came from Bovel, you didn't have to ask who was your father, your mother, your grandmother. We didn't check any further. The fact that you came from Bovel alone was sufficient, because Ezra had already checked everybody out. And this group comes. Now Ezra wanted Leviim to come because he wanted to rebuild the temple, and the temple required more Leviim than it did Kohanim. The Leviim were the maintenance people, they were the choir, he needed them. And the Leviim didn't come. He couldn't get together Leviim. So he punished the Leviim. That eventually when the Leviim did come to the land of Israel after the temple was built and the Jewish commonwealth was restored, he took away from the Leviim the right to collect Meiser, to have the tithe. The tithe, the 10%, always went to the Levi. He took it away from them and he gave it to the Kohanim. And the Leviim in the second temple didn't get Meiser because they didn't come to Eretz Yisrael with Ezra. And the Talmud says that the tragedy of the situation was that Ilu Olu Yisrael Kachoma, if the Jewish people would have come up like a wall, like a wave, like a tidal wave of people, if they would have really come from Bavel in numbers, then the second temple would have been as great as the first temple, would have had all the miracles, it would have had everything. But since that didn't happen, in effect the Jews said, well, we don't, we really don't want it because we want to stay in Bavel. And there are midrashim that Ezra sent messengers to Jews throughout the known world. There's even a medrash that he sent all the way to Spires and Worms and Mainz, where there was a Jewish community. And they said, why should we come? We're in good shape here. Lama lonu li Yerushalayim. What do we need Yerushalayim? Here we have a Yiddish Leden. Here it's everything is wonderful. Why should we come? And the legend goes on. It's all a legend. But the legend has a moral to it, that's why those cities suffered the most in the first in the Crusades. That's why those cities were destroyed, those Jewish communities were destroyed, because they told Ezra, that we're not interested. In any event, Ezra comes. Now the book of Ezra is written in Hebrew and in Aramaic, like the book of Daniel. And it goes back and forth. In the book, Ezra describes that he comes and he sees all the intermarriage. And he sees the stores open on Shabbat. And he sees the walls are not being built. And he sees this terrible chaos of Jewish life. And Ezra somehow reverses it. He cannot reverse it by himself. He'll need Nehemiah, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But mainly he's the one that reverses it. How does he do it? First of all, Ezra is an enormously magnetic, charismatic character. People love Ezra. Nobody loves Nehemiah, as we'll see. Nehemiah he doesn't get ulcers, he gives ulcers. That's his personality. Ezra is just a wonderful person. Secondly, Ezra has a pipeline, so to speak, to the Lord. He prays all the time. We see Ezra constantly at prayer. We have Ezra's prayer in Slichos that we say, Ezra Sofer Omer Lefanecha. Ezra said as follows. And God listens to Ezra. And therefore Ezra has power. Even though he doesn't have political power, even though he doesn't have military power, he has power. And eventually he is able to have the stores closed on Shabbat. But more than that, eventually he is able to convince many to divorce their non-Jewish wives, to separate from their non-Jewish wives, and to begin life anew, this time as Jews. We'll see that not all of them were willing to do it, and it won't be until the time of Nehemiah that this project is completely successful. But as I mentioned to you, Nehemiah is, bash in your face, straight. You want the non-Jewish wife, and he can't live in Jerusalem. Get out of here. You have two choices. You're either Jewish or not. And we'll see that Nehemiah has the power to back it up. Ezra makes takonos. He makes many decrees. They're listed in the Gemara Bava Kama. The Gemara Bava Kama lists the decrees of Ezra. The two main decrees that I want to dwell upon. The first is how to write the Hebrew alphabet. Now, we write today basically Ksav Ashuri. I'm not talking about cursive writing. I'm talking about the writing of the Sefer Torah or the block print writing. So that's block. That's Ksav Ashuris, it's called. Assyrian script. that came with the Jews from Bavel. Now, there's a machlokus in the Rishonim regarding this. The Rosh and others hold that this script always existed within the Jewish people, and that this was the script on Sinai. And there are midrashim that support that, because we have a medrash that on the Ten Commandments, one of the miracles on the Ten Commandments was that they were engraved through and through. So, for instance, if you made a mem, so then the middle would fall out. Or if you made a samach, the middle would fall out because there was nothing to hold it. So the Gemara says, mem v'samach b'nes oyomdim. They stood by, there was one of the miracles. So that presupposes that the Ten Commandments were in Ksav Ashuri. However, the Yerushalmi says the ayin and the pei were benes, because the Yerushalmi was of the opinion that the original script was the ancient Hebrew script. And the ancient Hebrew script is not Ksav Ashuri. It's a different script completely. If you go to the museums here in the country, etc., or sometimes even if you have a good commentary to the book of Ezra, they'll have in the back of it the comparison of the different Hebrew scripts. In any event, Ezra made the Ksav Ashuri the script. The second takona of Ezra, which is the takona that we have today, is that the Bezdin would meet twice a week, every Monday and Thursday, in the main towns, and anyone that had an affair to bring to the court would find the court sitting there automatically on Mondays and Thursdays. And therefore, as a corollary to that, Ezra also made the takona that there would be Kriyas HaTorah every Monday and Thursday in the synagogue. Shabbos for Mincha, the Kriyas HaTorah is a takona of Moshe Rabbeinu. But the takona to read every Monday and Thursday, that's a takona of Ezra. So Ezra also began the development of Torah Shabbal Peh, laid the cornerstone for later what would become the Mishnah and then the Talmud, by concentrating that Torah Shabbal Peh should no longer be restricted. There was we have a parallel thing by Kabbalah. The Torah Shabbal Peh in the time of the first temple was pretty much restricted to the scholars, to the professional scholars of Israel, and to the prophets. But it wasn't widespread amongst the people. People who were observant but not learned. Ezra is the one that popularized it. He made it for the people, so that the Torah Shabbal Peh and the methods by which Torah Shabbal Peh should be studied would become known to everyone and would become the province of the entire Jewish nation. Now, the walls are still not built and the temple is still not finished. In the Persian Empire, in the court of the king, so as I discussed with you, we studied the book of Daniel, there were many Jewish courtiers. And the Jewish courtiers were observant Jews, learned Jews. And the Persian emperors relied upon them. They relied upon them for diplomacy. They relied upon them for advice. They were very influential. You know, the protocols of the elders of Zion, right? The Jews ran the world. One of the courtiers in Artaxerxes' court is a man called Veנחmia. And Veנחmia is aware of the difficulties that Ezra is encountering in the land of Israel. He's aware of the intermarriage, he's aware of the loss of ritual, but mainly he's aware of the fact that the Jews have no power. They have no ability to defend themselves. and therefore they cannot build the walls. They cannot build the walls. You will not have a strong Jewish community in Jerusalem. You'll be unable to finish building the temple, and you're always at the mercy of the marauders, and the marauders need not be many, just as we see by us, right? It only takes one terrorist to get on a bus. So Nehemiah comes to the king and he tells him not a half-truth, but he doesn't tell him the full story. He tells him, first of all, he explains that he's a pious Jew and that he has dreams, right? Dreams are very important because the whole world was afraid of dreams. And all the Persian emperors had dreams. And they were especially wary of Jews who had dreams because of the fact that Daniel was the one that was able to interpret the wall, the writing on the wall, etc. with all. So therefore, he comes and he tells me he went. And in the dream he is told that he should go to the land of Israel, the land of his forefathers, because he has to visit the graves of his forefathers, the burial place of his ancestry. The king says, oh, all right, I'll give you a leave of absence. You can go. So then he says, but I can't go alone. It's a dangerous country. A lot of problems there. I'd like you to send, a battalion, 2 battalions, a division of troops under me, armed, supplied, so that it'll be safe. And the king says, okay, I'll do that. So here for the first time, you have a Jewish army, so to speak, even though the army is not made up solely of Jews. What Nehemiah did was arm as many Jews as he could and induct them in his army, but there also were many Persians in the army. Now what happened to those Persians is also a discussion. It had a lot of opinion that they converted and they became Jewish once they came here. There's a lot of parallelisms in the Second Temple story to our situation. However, nobody should jump to conclusions. But it's, here you have a non-Jew who's willing to risk his life on behalf of the Jewish state, right? And you tell him, we don't want him. So that doesn't resonate. Hard to sell that. So Nehemiah comes. And he comes with another 12,000, but this 12,000 is armed. And as I mentioned to you, he's a pious Jew, he's a holy Jew, but he doesn't pray to God. He does. He says, let's leave God out of this. And he is very, very strong. He comes to the priestly class and he says, either you all divorce your non-Jewish wives, either you get rid of them or you're out. You're not a priest, you're not in the temple, you're not in Jerusalem, goodbye. And since he's standing there with armed men, so he explained it to them, so that they understood what he meant. And he said, all the stores are going to be closed on Shabbat. If you have armed men, then all the stores are closed on Shabbat. So you have here the problem, is that the way to do it? So we would all prefer that somehow a spirit from heaven would invade everyone and they would see the rectitude of the matter and they would do it all on their own. But in the absence of that happening, and Nehemiah didn't rely on that, Ezra did. Ezra prayed for that. Nehemiah didn't. Nehemiah said, listen, while you're praying, I'm going to do something. And so the stores are closed, the non-Jewish women are sent away, and the work on building resumes. And as Nehemiah describes, one hand was on the trowel, on the bricks, and the other hand held the spear. And that is how the work proceeded. And anyone that tried to stop the work was killed. So Nehemiah runs a war in the country. And he runs a war against the enemies of the Jews. And he runs a war against certain of the Jews themselves. He tells Ezra, for instance, how can you expect that they should rally to your appeal to send away their non-Jewish wives, make an appeal? Ezra said we should make an appeal to all the Jewish people, and all the heads, the Kohanim, should sign on the appeal. And he said, how can you expect it when they're married to non-Jews? It's a little like happens in the Jewish world in the United States today, that the people in charge of the Jewish people themselves are either intermarried or the families are intermarried. So it's not easy or not really logical to expect that somehow they're going to come out strongly against intermarriage. People don't speak against their own interests and against their own families and against their own way of life. But Nehemiah, because of the fact that he has this power, the king trusted him so that he gave him carte blanche. He gave him a letter that says to all of the governors of Judea and all the Persian officials and everybody, whatever Nehemiah wants, Nehemiah gets. You'll do whatever he says. And since he has this tremendously forceful personality, and he minces no words, and it's clear what he wants, so therefore it happens. And Ezra and Nehemiah combine to create a great convention, which they call the entire Jewish population, maybe then 85,000 Jews. They call them together, and Ezra makes an impassioned speech in which he describes the Jewish history from the time of Abraham till his day, and he describes what God wants from them. And the speech is also witnessed by the three prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, who existed at that time. There's an opinion in the Talmud that Malachi is Ezra himself. There are three opinions in the Talmud as to who Malachi is. But one opinion is that Malachi is Ezra. Another opinion, Malachi is a separate person himself. But in any event, at this great gathering, they draw up a protocol. And this protocol is called the Bris Amunah, the covenant of the faith. The covenant that it's a renewal of the covenant of Israel with God in tradition. And everybody signs on it. Everybody commits themselves to it. And it is the Bris Amunah more than anything else that reverses this whole trend, that reverses this whole breakdown of Jewish life and restores the strength. And now Nehemiah is able to complete the walls, so that provides security. And the Jews lived in a triangle from Beit El in the north. They didn't spread all over the country. In Beit El in the north, to Beit Lechem in the south, to Kiryat Ono in the west. There are 19 cities that are mentioned in Ezra that had Jewish populations. Yericho had a Jewish population. Even Azza had a Jewish population. But those weren't large Jewish populations. They were like outlying small communities. But the main Jewish community was centered upon Jerusalem. And this was the triangle from Beit El north of Jerusalem to Beit Lechem south of Jerusalem to Ono, which was west of Jerusalem. That was the area of Jewish settlement. Eventually more and more Jews came from Bovel, and eventually Jews came from Egypt as well, and eventually the Jewish population grew so that by the time of the Hashmonaim, the Jews are living in the entire part of the country, in all parts of the country, in the Galilee, in the Negev, in the Sharon Plain. And the Hashmonaim came from Modi'in. They expand and live in the entire area. But originally, the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, they're compressed into this small area around Yerushalayim, and the temple is rebuilt. Now, the temple was rebuilt very, very modestly. Chazal say that those who were children when the first temple was destroyed, who still saw the first temple, when they saw the second temple 70 years later, wept, not out of joy, but out of embarrassment, because they had seen the great temple of Solomon, gold and marble, every conceivable miracle there, and the second temple was wood and plain stone. So we're not speaking about the temple of Herod, which was rebuilt in splendor. The second temple was rebuilt at least 4 times. But the first time that it was built, in the time of Ezra, it was built very, very modestly. And so even though it was dedicated and the temple operated, and there was a temple, but there were, the miracles were missing, and the physical grandeur was missing. The entire awe of the place, the aura, none of that was there. And therefore people were underwhelmed. But to Nehemiah and to Ezra, that was the great accomplishment. The great accomplishment was that they finished the walls, that the temple was rebuilt, and you had this bris hamona. You had the covenant that people agree that they're going to behave like Jews, that they're going to be Jewish. And so therefore that combination of events they felt was the great, and it was, that was the great accomplishment. The other great accomplishment was that they founded the Anshe Knesset Hagdola. They created a body, since there was no government, because the Persians wouldn't allow a government, so to speak. So there was this convocation of 120 elders, led by Ezra, and included the prophets, Chagai, Zechariah, Malach, it included Nehemia, it included Mordechai, included all the great men of the generation. And this great organization, the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, saw to it that Torah became the basic constitution of the country, and that the rule of Torah and the study of Torah would be the safeguard for the Jewish people. And until today, we are beholden to the Anshe Knesset Hagdola for what they accomplished. It's interesting, I mean, tonight is the night of the vote in the Knesset. The reason that they call it the Knesset is because in their modesty they named themselves after the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, and they also have 120 people. That's not quite the same. But it says something about the aspirations of the Jewish people, that we would like to have a Knesset Hagdola again. We would like to have such a body, such an organization, because it revitalized and rebuilt the Jewish people. Reb Reuven Margolius, in his wonderful sefer on the construction of the Mishnah, Yesod HaMishnah V'Arichosa, the foundation of the Mishnah and how it was edited. So he mentions that there were 120 people. When one of them died, they were never replaced. In other words, if one died, so there are now only 119. And when it says, therefore, in Pirkei Avot, Shimon HaTzadik, Hoya Mishiorei Knesset Hagdola, he was from the last of the Knesset Hagdola. It means either he was the last living member or one of the last living members of the Knesset Hagdola. He was young when it began, and he outlived everyone else, because the Knesset Hagdola could not be reconstituted again, because when the prophets died, there was no more prophecy. All prophecy ended with Malachi, and there were no more prophets, and there was no one to take the place of Ezra either. And so what happened is that by attrition, the Anshe Knesset Hagdola ended. But when the Anshe Knesset Hagdola ended, there was already a tradition of learning strong enough, of Torah strong enough, that it led to the creation of the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Jewish way of life that we know today, because of the fact that the Anshe Knesset Hagdola were able to inculcate that within the Jewish people. We know nothing about the personal lives of either Ezra or Nehemia. And we are not told anything. The Talmud doesn't tell us anything. However, we know that they had descendants. The Talmud says Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah was the 10th generation from Ezra. He was a descendant from Ezra. And what we also know is that when the rabbis wanted to eulogize someone, so when they eulogized Hillel, they said, Talmido shel Ezra. Hillel was the disciple of Ezra, even though Hillel never saw Ezra. But they meant that Hillel in his time did for the Jewish people what Ezra did in his time. And later on they said about great rabbis, Talmido shel Hillel, that he was the disciple of Hillel, even though, again, it's 10 generations later, they don't know anything about Hillel. They never saw him. But in their generation, they represented what Hillel had accomplished in his generation in the recreation and strengthening of Torah and its values. Now, in the book of Ezra, we are told many interesting things. We're told that Koresh's original permission was a very narrow permission. And it didn't spell out really the rights of the Jews. And therefore the non-Jewish tribes were able to say, you know, but he didn't give you permission to do this, because the assumption was that anything that was not explicitly given, permission that was not explicitly given, could not be, like the American Constitution originally, the federal government, whatever rights it was given had to be specifically mentioned in the Constitution. Otherwise, all those rights were reserved for the states. Of course, it's changed over the centuries, but it was the same idea that the Jews were only entitled to those specific rights that the letter, that the permission gave them. And they were, the rights were mentioned only generally. And not only that, Koresh neglected to give them a budget, which, as we all know, is essential. Right? That's the people will tell you. I've dealt with the Israeli government on a few matters. They say, great idea, we want to do it, but we can't pay for it. So, you know, so if they don't pay for it, who needs them? And in essence, therefore, the return of Koresh, the rights of return of Koresh were really very moderate. But nevertheless, since Koresh was the first one, he gets the credit. Now, when Doryovish, when Darius gave them rights to go back the second time, so then he expanded the rights. But he also didn't give them much of a budget, but he gave them more rights. He spelled out what the Kohanim were supposed to do, spelled out what the temple was supposed to look like. He even bothered to give the dimensions of the temple, that you should build it this and this way, you know, not too big, not too small, etc. When that fell apart, so then we have the third time, which is the time that Ezra came and Nehemiah came, and that is the permission from Artaxerxes, from Xerxes. And here they had the broadest rights. But it still was insufficient. What really gave them rights was the letter that he gave to Nehemiah. The letter that said, do what you want, and I'll back you. It's a remarkable letter. A remarkable thing that the Persian king would give to any of his courtiers, such powers. You know, it's really carte blanche. Do whatever you want. Everybody will listen to you. You force the issues, etc. And Nehemiah is the one that arrogated to himself all of these rights. And therefore he did far more than perhaps what the Persian emperor had in mind. What is interesting is that eventually Nehemiah returns to the Persian empire, He does not stay in the land of Israel. Ezra dies in the land of Israel. We don't know where his burial place is. Again, he is like Moshe, that God spared him that. That people would know where his tomb is, you know, and they'd be selling postcards and Diet Coke outside. So he didn't want that. He's buried somewhere here in the country. But Nehemiah is buried in Iran. And the Persian Jews have a tradition as to where he's buried, just as they have a tradition where Mordechai and Esther are buried. So eventually, after we get done with our tour of Iraq, and then we'll have a tour of Iran, so I'm sure that they'll take everyone to these burial sites, and you'll be able to pray at the tomb of Nehemiah as well. But he goes back. He goes back heartbroken because he wanted to stay. It's like the only personal reference in the entire book. But he said, a word is a word. And the king did so much for me, and he did so much for the Jewish people, and now that he demands that I return, so then he said, I have to keep my word. I have to return, and he goes back, and he never again comes back to the land of Israel. Even though there would be no Jewish community in the land of Israel if it were not for Nehemiah. Ezra is the one that implants within the Jewish people the idea of integration and separation. That the Jewish people will be integrated into the Persian Empire. They'll be part of the great world, but that they're separate. He calls it Am Kodesh, holy people. Skula mikol ha'am. You're going to be separate. And that your task is how to live in the world and yet live separately. How to be by yourself, but nevertheless to be part of the bigger picture as well. And that basically has been the trick of the Jewish people over the past thousands of years, is how to live in a world that is non-Jewish or even antithetical to Judaism, and be part of that world and contribute to that world, and yet remain Jewish. Remain Jewish to the nth degree. I was once in the house of a very great rabbi, I don't want to mention his name, and he was a big expert in a certain field of secular studies. And I happened to come to visit him, and when I was there, he was speaking to two professors, and they were discussing this field in secular studies, and the professors and he were having a discussion about it, and he explained it all and everything. And I was there, I was like a fly on the wall, you know, watching this. I don't know why he let me stay there, but he did. And then when it was over and they walked out, he turned to me and he said, but I want you to know that all of this is not worth one line in the Tosfos. He said it in Yiddish. So to me, that was the epitome of it, right? He's in the world, he's contributing, the professors come to talk to him, he talks to them, but in his heart he knows that the one line in the Tosfos is more than what all of this is all about. And so Ezra is, to a certain extent, the father of that idea of being able to live separately. The Gemara says that Ezra and the Anshe Knesses Hagdola destroyed the Yetzer Hara of paganism that existed amongst Jews in the first temple. In the second temple, there also were Jews who became pagans, but it was not to the extent, and it was not the official policy of the Jewish people the way it was in the first temple. The first temple, the Jewish kings themselves created paganism and established idols and did all of those things. So the Gemara says, in the Gemara's inimitable fashion, that they got a hold of the Yetzer Hara and they put its eye out. They knocked its eye out. They knocked out the eye of Avodah Zarah. So the Gemara asks, as only the Gemara can, why did they knock out the other eye already, right? You got the Yetzer Hara in your hand, you know, knock out this. So they said they tried to knock out the other eye and they saw that chickens stopped laying eggs. The world comes to an end without having a Yetzer Hara. So they had to leave that eye in so that the world should keep on going. But the eye of Avodah Zarah, the eye of paganism, that was removed. That was the accomplishment of Ezra and Nehemiah. So this book of Ezra and Nehemiah is a thin book, relatively speaking. It's a difficult book because of the language. It has a lot of names in it, a lot of places, a lot of name places. but you have to see that the book tells you the story of how the Jewish people reconstituted themselves after the destruction of the first temple, how they built the second temple, and how they built a kingdom of Torah. And the kingdom of Torah would last longer than the temple and longer than the second commonwealth. And it would be the kingdom of Torah more than anything else that would serve for the preservation of the Jewish people throughout all of the ages. I want to thank you all for coming to this lecture series.